March 4th, 1973. A heavy, unnatural silence hung over the woods near Chapin, Saginaw County, Michigan. Wayne and Bill Summers, two young brothers exploring an abandoned logging path, stumbled upon a sight that would shatter the tranquility of their childhood: the partially clothed body of a young woman. Her cranberry-red coat, familiar to those who knew her, was stained, and the innocence of the Michigan countryside was irrevocably tainted. When Saginaw County deputies arrived, the scene was horrifying. The initial hopes that Dawn had simply run away or been held captive died with the grim confirmation. She lay riddled with .322 caliber bullets, 2 to the head, 1 to the back. Signs of a brutal struggle were evident: scrapes on her arms, torn clothing, testament to a desperate fight for life. The young wife and mother, full of life and dreams just weeks before, had been executed. The initial theory of a random disappearance collapsed. A predator had been there, someone meticulous, someone who left behind a brutal, nearly perfect crime scene that offered few immediate clues. For nearly 3 decades, the murder of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar haunted Michigan. A young life extinguished too soon. A husband, a mother, and a son left searching for answers that never came. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. Dawn's death was not just a local tragedy. It was the first domino exposing decades of hidden violence in the life of her killer. In 2001, new advancements in DNA technology identified a suspect. It wasn't an unknown drifter. It wasn't a random stranger. It was a man with a violent past, a confirmed presence in the area, and a history of suspicion in similar brutal crimes. A man who had walked among Michiganders for years, his monstrous secret carefully concealed. The case shows the persistence of families who never gave up, detectives who refused to let files gather dust, and modern investigative techniques giving voice to long-silenced victims. The community of Chesaning was changed forever. Fear tore through the quiet village like a cold wind off Lake Huron years after the fact. Neighbors eyed neighbors, whispering suspicions. The hidden darkness beneath small-town life was revealed, and it would crack wide open when the truth came out nearly 3 decades later. The most haunting fact: the key suspect, with his chilling past, had evaded justice for far too long. For decades, he lived a seemingly normal life, raising his own family, hiding unimaginable secrets behind a mask of normalcy. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. I'm always fascinated to see how far these stories travel and how they connect us across distances. Today, we'll walk through the events of January and March 1973. We'll trace decades of unanswered questions and reveal the breakthrough that finally brought a twisted form of justice to Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. This is a story of loss, persistence, deception, and ultimately, justice delayed, but not denied. Chesaning, Michigan, in the crisp air of January 1973, was a quintessential Midwestern village where the rhythm of agricultural life blended with the quiet hum of close-knit families. Residents cherished their peaceful routines, Sunday church bells, and a sense of shared community where unlocked doors spoke of trust and mutual aid. In a cozy, 2-story home on Elm Street, filled with the warmth of recent marriage and the joyful, sometimes demanding sounds of a young family, Dawn Lee Swan Magyar lived with her husband, Donald, whom everyone affectionately called Don, and their 1-year-old son, Peter. At 20 years old, Dawn was vibrant and full of life, recently married and embarking on the exciting journey of building her future. Friends remembered her infectious laugh and a keen eye for finding unique gifts, a trait that often led her to the small boutiques and bustling aisles of the nearest shopping centers. As a young mother, Dawn meticulously balanced her duties with her eagerness to explore new facets of her life with Don. On the morning of January 27th, 1973, a chill hung in the Michigan air, but Dawn's spirits were bright. No one could have imagined it would be a fateful day. Dawn left her home as usual after kissing Peter goodbye and leaving him in Don's care. She was borrowing a silver 1970 Ford Pinto from her neighbor, Mildred Albright, a newer model that felt a bit like a luxury. She was heading to Owosso, a larger town about 20 minutes away, to visit the Owosso Plaza, a modern mall with a variety of shops. She had a list of items for her new home with Dawn, and perhaps a few small gifts she'd spotted for her mother, Eleanor Swan, whose birthday was approaching. The drive was familiar, the sky a muted winter gray, promising the quiet beauty of a Michigan Sunday. Security, in the modern sense, was virtually non-existent in shopping centers of that era, but the plaza bustled with activity. Dawn moved through the stores, picking up household goods and admiring window displays. Around 2:30 p.m., she ran into Janice Simpson, a close friend from high school, near the entrance of the J.C. Penney. They exchanged a cheerful greeting, chatted briefly about Dawn and Peter and their plans for the week, and promised to catch up properly soon. Dawn, her arms full of packages, smiled, mentioning she had a few more stops before heading back to Chesaning to get dinner ready for Don and to relieve him from childcare. It was a brief, ordinary encounter, but it became the last confirmed sighting of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. As the late afternoon sun began its early descent, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted fields, Dawn grew anxious. Dawn should have been home hours ago. Peter, typically a cheerful baby, had grown fussy, his contented gurgles replaced by insistent cries that Dawn couldn't quite soothe. He stood on the porch, occasionally walking to the end of their street, peering toward the main road where Mildred's Pinto should have turned. The cheerful hum of their home slowly gave way to an eerie silence, punctuated by Peter's escalating wails. Dinner, which Dawn was supposed to prepare, remained uncooked. Calls to Mildred confirmed Dawn hadn't returned the car. As darkness settled, thick and heavy, the once lively house felt hollow, filled only with Dawn's growing dread and Peter's persistent cries for his mother. No message, no warning. Dawn, the cornerstone of Dawn's new life and Peter's entire world, had vanished into thin air. Initial unease quickly escalated into suffocating panic. To Dawn and Dawn's mother, Eleanor, each passing hour sharpened a chilling question. Where had Dawn Lee Swan Magyar gone, and what happened to her after that cheerful chat at the Owosso Plaza? As the clock ticked past 9 p.m., Don could wait no longer. His heart pounding with dread, he grabbed the landline, his hands trembling as he dialed the Chesaning Police Department. His voice, hoarse but firm, told the dispatcher, "My wife is missing." Peter, now exhausted, had finally drifted off in his crib, but his silent presence loomed large. Within 20 minutes, the stark white and black patrol cars of the Chesaning Police and Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department pulled up to the curb, their lights casting jagged shadows across the front lawn. Two officers, Patrolman Jedediah Clark and Deputy Roscoe Hammond, entered, their notebooks open, asking cold, practical questions that felt almost cruel in their detachment. They asked Dawn to recount Dawn's exact schedule, what time she left, which mall she visited, and whom she might have seen. Dawn answered in detail, his voice strained but resolute. Dawn's mother, Eleanor Swan, sat beside him, her face pale and etched with worry, nodding in confirmation, occasionally glancing towards Peter's silent room. Deputy Hammond asked what Dawn was wearing when she left. Don closed his eyes, picturing her. A warm, cranberry red wool coat, dark jeans, and her favorite worn leather boots. She always dressed simply, but with a touch of flair, he whispered, his hands clenched. The officers pressed further. Did Dawn show signs of depression? Were there recent marital conflicts or financial pressures that might make her want to disappear? Don nearly snapped. No, he insisted, his voice rough and deliberate, silencing the room for a moment. She had no reason to leave this family. No reason to leave me and Peter. The officers jotted a few more notes and exchanged a skeptical glance that didn't escape Don. He felt suspected rather than supported. Outside, the police presence drew neighbors closer. First, a few peered from behind curtains, then Marjorie Peterson, an elderly woman from next door, brought over a casserole, her eyes wide with worry. Harold Jenkins, the mailman who lived down the street, walked over with a flashlight, offering to help search. Whispers spread, some praying, others speculating. The Magyar home, once a beacon of newlywed joy, shifted from tension to utter chaos. The landline rang constantly. Calls from Dawn's brothers, Max and Larry Swan, from friends like Janice Simpson, all asked the same question. Is it true she's missing? Have you found anything? Dawn repeated the same exhausted answer. No, we don't know anything yet. Eleanor sat in a corner, clutching a framed photo of Dawn, trembling, feeling their once safe world turn foreign and terrifying, acutely aware of Peter sleeping soundly in the next room, unaware of the storm brewing around him. As daylight broke on January 28, 1973, the darkness and unease lingered. Owosso and Chesaning residents stepped out of their homes, haunted by the previous night's news. Stories buzzed in corner diners and gas stations, anxious glances exchanged on the way to school, all centered on Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. For Dawn and Eleanor, it was their first morning without Dawn, when fear became chilling reality. Peter awoke, his confused cries joining the heavy silence of the house, a constant reminder of the absence. Police returned early, bringing large maps to outline search areas. Dawn, haggard from a sleepless night, pointed out places Dawn frequented in Owosso. Eleanor, after calming Peter, tried to recall every detail, Dawn's habits at the mall where she usually parked. At 8 a.m., an emergency meeting convened at the Owosso Police Department. A search team formed, including city police, the Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department, and dozens of community volunteers, neighbors, friends, even strangers compelled to help. Hastily printed flyers with Dawn's photo and bold text, "Missing." "Have you seen Dawn Lee Swan Magyar?" were distributed across roads, convenience stores, churches, and gas stations. A copy was taped to the entrance of the Owosso Plaza, where she was last seen. The search began along Dawn's usual routes. Groups fanned out through Owosso and surrounding rural roads, combing alleys, calling her name with faint hope she was merely lost or injured. K-9 units traced her scent from the mall's parking lot to the main roads, but the trail vanished as if Dawn had been swallowed by the towns. By midday, tension gripped the search team. Don, after leaving Peter with Eleanor, stood at the search's edge, watching, his eyes flickering with hope that dimmed with each shake of a police officer's head. Owosso residents gathered at cordoned-off areas, whispering speculations. Local reporters recorded every move, and the Owosso Argus Press ran a bold headline, "Young Chesaning Mother Vanishes. Police Expand Search." In the afternoon, the search extended to lesser-used parking lots and quiet streets around Owosso Plaza. when a team of volunteers, led by Officer Charles Finch of the Owosso Police Department, approached a secluded lot behind the old Montgomery ward, hidden partially by a stand of pines. They spotted a silver 1970 Ford Pinto. Dust lightly coated its windows. As they drew closer, hearts sank. It was Dawn Lee Swan Magyar's car. Police immediately cordoned off the area, ordering everyone to stay back. Dawn and Eleanor were called to the scene. Upon seeing the familiar borrowed car, Dawn's legs nearly gave out. Eleanor sobbed, clinging to Doris Miller, a family friend who had joined the search, her mind fixed on Peter back home, unwittingly waiting for a mother who might never return. Inside the car, police found Dawn's recently purchased packages on the passenger seat. Her brown leather purse lay on the dashboard, but the car keys, usually in the ignition, were scattered on the floorboard around the driver's seat. The seats were undisturbed, the doors showed no signs of tampering, yet the disarray of the keys hinted at a struggle, a forceful exit. Everything suggested Dawn had stepped out briefly and would return, but she never did. No trace indicated where she went. The car, silent, cold, parked by the pines, was a mute witness to an incomprehensible disappearance. As the afternoon sun faded, Michigan's sky turned a deep gray. Officers stood around the car, their faces tense. Don watched, his mind fixed on one thought. Something terrible had happened. For Don and Eleanor, the faint hope that Dawn was simply delayed shattered. For Peter, unknowingly, his young life was forever altered. For the Owosso community, finding her abandoned car was the first shock in a long, haunting mystery. That night, the question, "Where is Dawn?" echoed in every home, spreading through the towns like an unshakable fear. That evening, after cordoning off the secluded lot behind Montgomery Ward, Owosso police decided to tow Dawn Lee Swan Magyar's silver Pinto to the Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department for processing as a critical crime scene. The car was loaded onto a tow truck amid the tense silence of the search team and lingering residents. Don stood nearby, his red-rimmed eyes tracking every movement, a nameless fear echoing within. The car was back, but Dawn was not. The police convoy cut through the cold January night, delivering the only significant evidence to the forensic investigation room. The atmosphere in the sheriff's department was thick with focus. A dedicated bay was cleared, covered with canvas tarps, and barricaded for meticulous examination. Forensic officers, with the rudimentary tools of 1973, magnifying glasses, tweezers, and flashlights, proceeded with strict protocol. They began by photographing the car from all angles, front, rear, sides, and roof. Every detail, from dust on the windows to scuff marks on the tires, was documented. As the examination continued, Detective Arthur Bennett, a seasoned officer from the Sheriff's Department assisting with the case, noted something unusual. On the floor mat in the passenger side, barely visible beneath a package, was a small dark stain. Under a handheld ultraviolet light, it stood out faintly. A technician carefully swabbed the sample, sealing it in a labeled vial. It might be a mundane stain, but it could also be blood, a direct clue that Dawn was harmed before vanishing. Another technician inspecting the driver's seat found a single short strand of coarse dark hair caught in the seat's crevice. It differed from Dawn's lighter, fine hair. It was collected with sterile tweezers, sealed in a small plastic bag, and labeled. Every sample was catalogued, photographed, and documented. To the team, even the smallest detail could crack the case. Yet, in 1973, forensic technology had severe limits. DNA analysis was still decades away. Blood typing could only narrow down individuals to large groups, and hair analysis was mostly comparative, lacking the definitive power of modern science. The small stain and unfamiliar hair, though carefully preserved, led nowhere without matching data. While the forensic team worked, the station's hallways filled with reporters. Local papers updated the story relentlessly. News of the car's discovery spread across Owosso and Chesaning, sowing unease. That evening's TV broadcast on local channels opened with a tarp-covered Pinto, a ticker reading, "Missing woman's car found, but she remains missing." At the Magyar home, Dawn and Eleanor sat silently before the TV, seeing Mildred's familiar car on the news. Peter, sensing the pervasive anxiety, whimpered in Dawn's arms. Eleanor sobbed, repeating, "If the car's there, where's my girl?" Dawn had no answers, only holding her and Peter close. He knew the newfound evidence offered no hope, only deepened their fear. Finally, a preliminary report was drafted. The vehicle was found in a secluded parking lot. All personal belongings of the victim were inside. No signs of theft. A suspicious stain was collected from the floor mat, along with an unidentified hair. For the police, this report was a necessary step in the process. But for the Magyar family, it felt like an unformed verdict. Something terrible had happened to Dawn. The next morning, January 29th, the Owosso Argus Press hit the stands with bold headlines, "Missing woman's car found, still no Dawn Magyar." The Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department faced immediate pressure from the media and community. Yet, while searches continued outside, a quieter, more meticulous investigation unfolded behind the station's doors, focusing on witness interviews from the Owosso Plaza, where Dawn was last seen. Detective Barnes and Detective Brenda Farrell spent the morning poring over initial statements and carefully sketching out timelines by hand. They confirmed Dawn's departure from the plaza around 2:40 p.m. through Janice Simpson's recollection, and corroborated by Mr. Silas Croft, a stoic clerk at the plaza's Woolworths, who remembered seeing a young woman in a cranberry coat leaving with packages around that time. But what made the detectives repeatedly review their notes and diagrams was a consistent yet vague detail emerging from the parking lot. Phyllis Harding, who worked at the plaza's record store, had reported seeing Dawn in the parking lot. Phyllis said that after leaving the store, she stopped to load groceries into her trunk, a few rows from Dawn's car. She briefly saw Dawn talking to an unfamiliar man, tall, with receding brown hair, wearing a worn denim jacket. They seemed to exchange a few quiet words for less than a minute. Crucially, Phyllis also distinctly recalled seeing a dark blue Ford pickup truck, older model, idling nearby, then slowly pulling out as Dawn and the man disappeared from her view, walking quickly towards the back of the lot. Police listened closely, noting details. Male, about 40s, receding brown hair, worn denim jacket, dark blue Ford pickup. But Phyllis didn't see his face clearly, and the distance left her unsure whether they knew each other or were speaking casually. Ronald Davies, a plaza janitor, later confirmed seeing an old, faded, dark blue pickup truck parked unusually far from the main entrance for a good portion of the afternoon. No one, however, could recall a license plate. These were just vague but notable statements. In the briefing room, as the gathered witness accounts were presented, Detective Barnes frowned. They had a sequence. Dawn left the Owosso Plaza at 2:40 p.m. A mysterious dark blue pickup was seen, and multiple witnesses saw her talking to an unknown man, but nothing was solid enough to identify a suspect. The witness descriptions were consistent but lacked definitive identification. Everything stalled at suspicion. The Magyar family was called in for an update. Hearing the detailed accounts, Don couldn't hold back tears. He recognized Dawn's familiar gestures, the way she carried bags, her slight smile, now described by others. She wasn't worried. "No signs of anything wrong," Dawn said, voice choked. "That only means someone did something to her right after she left the store." Eleanor held his hand, thinking of Peter, who had clung to her all morning, sensing the pervasive sadness. In the Owosso community, these new details spread quickly. People whispered about the dark blue pickup, the strange man in the plaza lot. Some swore they'd seen a similar truck parked nearby before. Others claimed to have noticed a man matching the description near the store, but these were rumors lacking solid evidence. Police recorded and checked each tip, carefully cross-referencing names and vehicle descriptions, only to dismiss them for lack of corroboration. That evening, the news on local radio stations broadcast the latest witness descriptions detailing the dark blue pickup and the unknown man. The announcer read, "Witnesses recount Dawn Magyar's final moments." Who was the unknown man? The towns listened, many shaking their heads in a chill. From an ordinary young mother shopping, Dawn had become the center of an unsolved mystery, and the Owosso police, despite a few puzzle pieces, couldn't yet form a complete picture. The investigation report closed that day. Dawn Magyar was seen leaving the Owosso Plaza at 2:40 p.m. Multiple witnesses reported a dark blue pickup truck in the vicinity, and one saw Dawn speaking with an unidentified male. Insufficient data to identify a suspect. The next morning's paper ran, "Witness accounts provide clues, but Magyar disappearance remains elusive." In the Magyar home, Dawn and Eleanor stared at the paper, feeling lost in a dark maze. Peter, usually babbling happily, seemed quieter, mirroring the heavy atmosphere. Traces and paths, all leading to dead ends. Weeks stretched into a grim eternity for the Magyar family. February had given way to March, and still there was no sign of Dawn. Dawn and Eleanor clung to each other, their initial panic hardening into a dull, persistent ache. Peter, now 14 months old, often looked toward the front door, his innocent babbling tinged with a questioning sound, as if waiting for a familiar face. Eleanor, tirelessly caring for him, tried to explain, "Mama's coming home, sweetheart." But the words felt hollow even to her. The massive searches had dwindled, the flyers weathered and torn. The Owosso Argus Press no longer ran daily headlines, replacing them with smaller, more somber updates. The hope that had flickered in January was now a faint, fragile ember. Then, on the afternoon of Sunday, March 4th, 1973, a new horror unfolded. 10-year-old Wayne Summers and his 12-year-old brother, Bill Summers, were exploring a dense patch of woods on the outskirts of Chesaning, a small, unincorporated community in Saginaw County, not far from Chesaning. It was a place where local kids often built forts and chased squirrels, a wild, secluded area known for its winding deer trails and thick undergrowth. As they ventured deeper, near an abandoned logging path, a foul smell hit them. Following it, they stumbled upon a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A body, partially concealed by thorny bushes and a thin layer of winter debris. Frozen in terror, the boys raced home, bursting into their living room where their parents, Quentin and Helen Summers, were reading the Sunday paper. "We found something." "A person in the woods," Wayne stammered, his face pale. Within the hour, Saginaw County Sheriff's deputies were on the scene, led by Sheriff Vernon Hayes and his lead investigator, Detective Alvin Greer. The woods were immediately cordoned off. Forensic technicians, working quickly in the fading daylight, confirmed the worst. The partially clothed body was that of a young woman. Her cranberry-red wool coat, dark jeans, and worn leather boots were still identifiable. The wedding ring on her finger confirmed her identity: Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. The news, delivered by Detective Greer to a numb Dawn and a collapsing Eleanor, ripped through the Magyar home like a physical blow. The unspoken fear had become a horrifying reality. Dawn was not missing. She was dead. The coroner's initial examination at the scene, and later the full autopsy, painted a brutal picture. Dawn had been raped. She had been shot 3 times, once in the back and twice in the head, all from a .22 caliber firearm. The fatal shots, delivered with chilling precision, indicated a deliberate act of violence. There were also signs of a struggle, scrapes on her arms, torn clothing, suggesting Dawn had fought for her life in her final moments. The discovery site itself offered few immediate clues beyond the body. The cold, hard ground had preserved some evidence, but also made it difficult to find clear footprints or other forensic traces. The investigation immediately intensified, now a murder inquiry led by the Michigan State Police, with Detective Barnes and newly assigned Detective Sergeant Steve Harshberger at the forefront. The .22 caliber firearm became the immediate focus. Police canvassed gun owners in the Chesaning and Owosso areas. One individual, Robert Shaw, was quickly identified. Shaw, a Chesaning resident who had known Dawn through casual acquaintances, voluntarily provided his .22 caliber gun for testing. However, forensic analysis, rudimentary by today's standards but thorough for 1973, quickly ruled it out. The rifling marks on the bullets recovered from Dawn's body did not match Shaw's weapon. Another promising lead dissolved. News of Dawn's discovery spread like wildfire through Michigan. The Owosso Argus Press ran a black-bordered headline, "Dawn Magyar's Body Found. Murder Investigation Launched." The initial shock gave way to profound grief and a chilling fear that settled over the once peaceful communities of Chesaning and Owosso. Who would do such a thing to a young mother? Public pressure mounted on law enforcement to find the killer. At the Magyar home, the grief was overwhelming. Dawn moved through a haze of shock. Eleanor struggled with bouts of uncontrollable sobbing, holding Peter close, as if to shield him from the incomprehensible evil that had touched their family. Dawn's brothers, Max and Larry Swan, arrived, their faces grim, offering what support they could. The funeral, a somber affair at St. Christopher Parish in Chesaning, was attended by hundreds. Father Michael O'Connell spoke of Dawn's vibrant spirit and the profound loss. Dawn held Peter, a tiny, bewildered figure in his arms, as Dawn's casket was lowered into the earth. The community gathered around, offering condolences and sharing whispered prayers. But a sense of unease lingered, a dark shadow cast by the unsolved murder. As the weeks turned into months and the brutal Michigan winter gave way to a hesitant spring, the leads grew cold. Detectives Barnes and Harshberger chased every tip, interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on every dark blue pickup truck sighting, and meticulously catalogued every piece of evidence: the coarse, dark hair from the car, the blood stain, the recovered bullets. But the puzzle pieces refused to fit into a clear picture. The perpetrator seemed to have vanished without a trace, just as Dawn had. Detective Sergeant Harshberger and Detective Sergeant Mark Pendergraph, who joined the case to help organize the growing mountain of paperwork, found themselves increasingly frustrated. Without new evidence or a concrete suspect, the investigation slowly, painfully stalled. By the end of 1973, the initial intensity had faded. The large box labeled Magyar Dawn Lee Swan Murder, January 1973, was placed on a high shelf in the Sheriff's Department evidence room. Inside were hundreds of pages of reports, search maps, crime scene photos, and sealed samples like the blood stain, the unidentified hair, and the preserved bullets. All were stored, awaiting new technology or an unexpected lead to revive the case. No one knew when that day might come. For the Magyar family, however, the silence was not an end. It was the beginning of an agonizing, decades-long wait for justice. Dawn, Eleanor, and young Peter would carry the unbearable weight of Dawn's memory, a wound that time could never fully heal. One quiet evening, as twilight settled over Chesaning, Eleanor sat rocking Peter, humming a soft lullaby. He squirmed, then pointed a chubby finger at her face. "Mama," he babbled, a clear, sweet sound that pierced through the grandmother's heart. Eleanor froze, her eyes welling up. Dawn, watching from the doorway, felt a profound, aching sorrow. Peter, in his innocence, had given voice to the devastating truth of their loss, unknowingly calling out for the mother he would never truly remember. The case of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar had become what investigators called a cold case. For Chesaning, the once peaceful village now bore the indelible scar of a brutal, unsolved murder. By 1978, 5 years after Dawn Lee Swan Magyar vanished, the atmosphere in her family home had transformed entirely. Dawn Magyar, once a vibrant young husband, became a man etched with quiet grief. He worked diligently, came home to Peter and Eleanor, and cooked dinner, but his eyes held a permanent sadness. Eleanor Swan, despite her unwavering strength, visibly aged under the weight of her daughter's unresolved murder. She became Peter's primary caregiver, a constant, loving presence, though every mama from Peter, now a bright-eyed 5-year-old, still carried a bittersweet sting. The Magyar family continued to hold their prayer vigils, a tradition they maintained ever since Dawn went missing. Each year on January 27th, and again on March 4th, they gathered with a handful of loyal neighbors, including Mildred Albright and Marjorie Peterson, at St. Christopher Parish, or outside their home. Choked voices sang hymns in the cold Michigan night, prayers sent into the wind, hoping for the truth to emerge. For Dawn, Eleanor, and young Peter, it was the only way to keep Dawn's memory alive, ensuring the world remembered her presence and love. Peter, growing taller each year, stood beside his grandmother, holding a small white candle, his young face earnest, a silent participant in a grief he was too young to fully comprehend, but instinctively felt. The press, after a few years, occasionally revisited the case, but the tone shifted from initial empathy. It turned pessimistic. A forgotten murder, another Michigan unsolved homicide. Such stories cut the Magyar family, who never forgot, living with her absence every moment. But for society, time faded memory, and Dawn Magyar became another name on Michigan's long list of unsolved murders. In the Chesaning community, Dawn's case became a shadow. Some admitted openly, "At first we held hope, but after years, if the killer were to be found, he would have been found already." Others whispered that she must have encountered a drifter or someone from out of town. The division that had sparked grew into a clear fracture in the community, leaving unease about the trust and connection once taken for granted. Peter grew up in the shadow of loss, carrying memories of a mother he only knew through stories and fading photographs. He was a quiet, contemplative child, often found sketching alone, his imagination a refuge from the heavy silence that sometimes enveloped the house. In school, he sometimes faced cruel whispers. "Your mom was murdered, wasn't she?" Those careless words left him crying at his desk. Dawn, his father, remained his rock, but the profound loss unintentionally distanced them at times. Peter felt, at moments, as if he was fighting the world alone, even the silence within his own home. He'd often trace the outline of Dawn's face in old photos, wondering about the woman whose life was so brutally cut short. For nearly 2 decades, Dawn Magyar's file sat untouched in the cold case unit's storage, gathering dust. The initial clues, the small blood stain, the unidentified hair, the preserved bullets, remained sealed. The technology then available simply wasn't advanced enough to analyze them definitively. Michigan State Police juggled dozens of new cases, diverting budget and manpower. Dawn Magyar became just a name on a file among hundreds in Michigan's long list of unsolved missing persons. Yet, for the Magyar family, especially for Peter as he entered his 20s, the silence was never an end. Each vigil, each small article, each report of new scientific advancements sparked a flicker of hope. That fragile hope kept Peter going, waiting for the day the silence would break and the secret of his mother's disappearance would be revealed. In the mid-1990s, a quiet but significant shift began to occur in forensic science, the advent of advanced DNA technology. What was once considered science fiction, identifying an individual from a minuscule biological sample, was rapidly becoming reality. At the Michigan State Police DNA Laboratory in East Lansing, a dedicated team, including forensic expert Randy O. Colbury, began to revisit old, seemingly intractable cases fueled by the promise of this new science. Among hundreds of dusty files, one name resonated with veteran investigators like Detective Sergeant Steve Harshberger, who remembered the brutal cold of January 1973 and the young mother who vanished. Detective Lieutenant Gail V. Tobin authorized the re-examination of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar's case, believing the preserved biological evidence, the small blood stain, the unidentified hair, and most crucially, preserved seminal fluid found on Dawn's clothing, could now be retested with revolutionary new methods. Harshberger personally retrieved the meticulously labeled box from the evidence room. Opening it, he found the yellowed pages and sealed samples, a decade-old promise awaiting fulfillment. This was the key, he knew, a light after decades of darkness. Between 1995 and 1998, the Michigan State Police DNA Laboratory began the painstaking process. Samples were carefully unsealed. The minute traces of seminal fluid, fibers from Dawn's clothing, and the mysterious hair were subjected to the demanding new DNA amplification and profiling techniques. The results were slow but powerful. Several possible suspects, including Robert Shaw, whose .22 caliber gun had been ruled out decades prior, were definitively excluded through DNA. This meticulous process narrowed the field, confirming that the perpetrator's DNA was distinct and remained unidentified. The task ahead was clear. They had a DNA profile, but no match in any existing database. By the late 1990s, Steve Harshberger, who had spent decades occasionally pulling Dawn's file and never letting it truly rest, felt the pressing weight of time. He and Detective Mark Pendergraph began a meticulous review of every old lead, every person of interest, and every individual with a history of violent crime who had any connection to the Owosso or Chesaning areas in 1973. This was the arduous manual work that predated modern genealogical sleuthing. It relied on matching a new, unknown DNA profile to an old, known suspect's physical profile. It was during this exhaustive process that the name Gerald Leroy Wingart resurfaced. His file was a chilling read for Harshberger. A 1961 conviction for armed robbery and rape during his time at the University of Michigan, followed by 6 years in prison before his parole in the late 1960s. More strikingly, old reports placed him in the Owosso Chesaning area in January 1973, reportedly visiting a friend. And later, in 1981, he had been arrested in connection with the Laura Mae McVeigh murder case in Eaton Rapids, though that charge was dismissed on a technicality due to procedural violations during the search. The pattern was unmistakable: a violent past, a confirmed presence near the original crime scene, and a history of suspicion in similar brutal crimes. He fits the profile, the dates, the locations, the history, Detective Harshberger murmured to Detective Gail V. Tobin, his voice grim. He's our primary person of interest for a direct DNA comparison. By early 2001, investigators were preparing their move. Gerald Wingart, then 60 years old, was living a seemingly unremarkable life in Center Line, a Detroit suburb, with his fourth wife, Teresa Wingart. He worked in the accounting department at Chrysler's Sterling Heights stamping plant, reportedly well-respected in his local community. His adult daughter from a previous marriage lived nearby. To his neighbors, Richard and Sandra Ellis, he was just the quiet man who kept to himself, occasionally offering a nod or a polite wave. This veneer of normalcy made the task ahead even more unsettling. A covert surveillance plan was put into action. A small team of plainclothes officers from the Michigan State Police began monitoring Wingart's home. They watched his daily habits, leaving for work, grabbing groceries, his occasional trips to a local park. Their objective was clear: obtain a DNA sample without his knowledge for a direct comparison with the profile from the 1973 crime scene. On the morning of March 5, 2001, their patience paid off. Wingart left his house, walked to his mailbox, and stood there for a few minutes, smoking a cigarette before flicking the butt into the bushes lining his lawn. Once he was back inside, Detective Clara Monroe, one of the surveillance officers, quickly moved in, retrieving the discarded cigarette butt with sterile tweezers. It was carefully sealed and rushed to the Michigan State Police DNA laboratory. The wait for the results was agonizing. Dawn Magyar, now a grandfather, continued his quiet life in Chesaning, still attending annual vigils with Eleanor and Peter. Now a grown man of 29, haunted by the specter of his mother's unknown killer. Eleanor, her hair now fully white, still prayed daily for justice. When the call finally came, just 2 days later on March 7, 2001, it shattered 2 decades of silence. Randy O. Colbury's voice was calm, yet resolute. "We have a 100% definitive match. The DNA from the cigarette butt belongs to the perpetrator of the Dawn Magyar murder." The news sent a jolt through the Michigan State Police. Detective Harshberger felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with a chilling sense of vindication. A cold case, dormant for so long, was finally alive. An arrest warrant was swiftly issued for Gerald Leroy Wingart. The legal team, led by prosecutor Dwayne Dennis, recognized the constraints of the time. Due to the statute of limitations in place at the time of the crime, charges for rape and kidnapping could not be prosecuted. However, there was no statute of limitations for first-degree murder. They had their charge. At dawn on March 7, 2001, the quiet suburban street in Center Line where Wingart lived was swathed in a pre-spring mist. Unmarked police vehicles lined both ends. Officers from the Michigan State Police and local Center Line PD moved into position. As the clock ticked past 6 a.m., Detective Gail V. Tobin gave the command. The door to Wingart's home shook under a steel battering ram. "Michigan State Police! Search warrant! Open the door!" The shout ripped through the morning stillness, jolting the neighborhood awake. Seconds later, the door burst open. Officers, led by Sergeant Paul Griffin, rushed in. In the cluttered living room, filled with outdated furniture, Gerald Leroy Wingart stumbled out, eyes blurry, stammering, "What? What's going on?" In an instant he was pinned to the floor, hands cuffed behind him. The cold clink of metal ended nearly 3 decades of evasion. Neighbors peered from their windows. Richard Ellis, Wingart's next-door neighbor clutched his chest, stunned. My God, he seemed like such a quiet fellow, always kept his lawn neat. Another neighbor, Doris May Bell, shook her head, voice trembling. I waved to him just yesterday. You never know who you're living next to. Wingart, in a crumpled gray T-shirt, hair disheveled, wrists gleaming in cuffs, was escorted out. He shouted, I didn't do anything. You've got the wrong guy. But his cries were drowned by camera shutters. Dozens of reporters, alerted by the unfolding scene, waited. Images of Wingart's arrest hit Michigan news channels within minutes. The ticker read, Arrest in 1973 Dawn Magyar cold case. In a brief press conference afterward, held by prosecutor Duane Dennis alongside Detective Gail V. Tobin, the announcement reverberated across the state. After nearly 3 decades, we have arrested Gerald Leroy Wingart, 60, a Center Line resident, charged with the first-degree murder of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. DNA evidence, meticulously preserved and re-examined, clearly confirms his role. Reporters crowded, flashes blazing. A Detroit Free Press journalist asked, What was the suspect's motive? Detective Lieutenant Tobin replied calmly, It's too early to conclude, but we believe this was a brutal, deliberate act of violence. In the Magyar home, Don and Eleanor sat before the TV, Peter standing rigidly behind them, his hand on his father's shoulder. They watched Wingart in cuffs. Emotions surged, rage, relief, a profound sense of vindication. Don sighed, his voice thick with emotion. Finally, justice has knocked on our door. Eleanor, her face streaked with tears, whispered, Dawn, they found him? Peter, his eyes brimming, squeezed his father's shoulder. Mom, she's not forgotten anymore. The press exploded. Headlines dominated. Arrest made in 1973, Dawn Magyar cold case. Gerald Wingart, quiet neighbor or killer. 3 decades of silence. Justice finally speaks. TV stations brought in experts to discuss how DNA technology, specifically direct comparison, cracked the case, calling it a major triumph for Michigan's criminal investigations. Chesaning and Owosso buzzed. Many gathered to place flowers and candles outside the Magyar home, where Dawn's photo hung prominently by the window. Conversations in coffee shops, churches, and schools revolved around one name, Gerald Wingart. Some were outraged. He lived among us all those years while that family suffered. Others were baffled. I worked with him at Chrysler. Never thought he was a monster. For the investigators, Wingart's arrest wasn't the end, but a beginning. They knew the road ahead. Prosecution, trial, uncovering the full truth, would be long and thorny. But after decades in darkness, justice finally had a face to confront. For the Magyar family, it was a day to believe Dawn, wherever she was, found solace in the emerging truth. In the Michigan State Police interrogation room on March 8, 2001, Gerald Leroy Wingart slumped in a metal chair, hands cuffed before him. His haggard face, gray hair tangled, and eyes bloodshot from a night in custody, faced Detective Steve Harshberger's cold, resolute gaze. The room's clock ticked, a slow, relentless rhythm for a confrontation nearly 3 decades in the making. At the first question, Wingart snapped, I don't know her. Never heard of Dawn Magyar in my life. His voice was defiant. Harshberger didn't respond, instead sliding a thick file across the table. Photos of Dawn's car, the Owosso Plaza parking lot, and the detailed DNA report. You say you don't know her, Harshberger said slowly. So why was your DNA at the scene where she was abducted, Mr. Wingart? The DNA we found on her clothing? Wingart let out a hollow laugh. You're making this up. DNA can be wrong. But as Harshberger detailed the evidence, the meticulously preserved seminal fluid and fibers from 1973, untouched until sent to the modern lab, the 100% match with his discarded cigarette butt, the exclusion of all other suspects, Wingart's smile vanished. He stared at the table, silence stretching. Harshberger watched his every move. His hands twitched, neck veins pulsed, signs of immense strain. Wingart, despite his past, refused to break, denying any involvement, rambling about his hard life and being unfairly targeted. He claimed he was just an ordinary man hunted. Harshberger, a veteran of countless interrogations, knew the fight was far from over, but he held the most powerful weapon, undeniable DNA evidence. For prosecutor Duane Dennis, that was more than enough for a strong indictment. That evening at the Magyar home, Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter heard about the interrogation. When Detective Harshberger recounted Wingart's denials, a fresh wave of pain and fury washed over them. "He's lying," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. Peter, now standing as tall as his father, gripped his dad's arm. "He won't get away with it." "Not this time." The press blared. "Suspect in Dawn Magyar case denies all charges." But for the family, and for the increasingly enraged community, the DNA spoke louder than any denial. On April 20th, 2001, at the Montgomery County Court, the formal indictment against Gerald Leroy Wingart was announced. After weeks of forensic analysis and evidence consolidation, prosecutor Duane Dennis declared charges of first-degree murder. The document detailed every piece of evidence, the perpetrator's DNA profile from the crime scene, the 100% DNA match with Wingart, the forensic report confirming Dawn was raped and shot 3 times with a .22 caliber firearm, and the historical records placing Wingart in the vicinity with a history of violent offenses. The crux was the direct DNA match, undeniable proof linking Wingart to the brutal crime. The press room afterward was packed with reporters. Duane Dennis, standing beside Detective Lieutenant Gail V. Tobin and Randy O. Colbury, who was from the DNA lab, held the indictment high for cameras. His voice resonated. Justice may be delayed, but never gone. Today, we charge Gerald Leroy Wingart for the brutal acts that took Dawn Lee Swan Magyar's life. After nearly 3 decades, the truth is finally exposed. The statement was quoted across newspapers and broadcast on Michigan's TV channels as a proclamation. Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter sat in the front row. As the prosecutor read the charges, Eleanor clutched Dawn's hand, tears streaming. Dawn nodded slightly, eyes fixed on the podium. Peter stood firm, his jaw tight. Dawn whispered, "Dawn, they've finally named what happened to you." For the Magyar family, the indictment wasn't just legal paperwork. It was validation that Dawn was a victim of a monstrous crime, not a woman who simply vanished, as cruel rumors once claimed. Outside the courthouse, Michigan's community gathered in droves. Many held white candles and Dawn's photo raised high for TV cameras. An old Chesaning neighbor, Clara Jennings, choked up during an interview. "Decades we lived in doubt and division. Today, justice gave us an answer." The Detroit Free Press ran a bold headline: "Gerald Wingart formally charged in 1973, Dawn Magyar murder." TV channels analyzed how direct DNA comparison unlocked the case, calling it one of Michigan's most significant investigative breakthroughs. Editorials emphasized, society must not forget missing victims as a single new spark can bring justice back. For the investigative team, led by Harshberger and Tobin, the indictment day was a milestone. They recalled retrieving the dusty case file with faint hope. Now it was a full criminal case headed to trial. Relief and resolve surged within them. "We brought Dawn home," and now we must bring Wingart to justice. The trial was set for November 2001. As the date neared, tension mounted. The press called it Michigan's biggest cold case trial in decades. The community split. Most believed Wingart guilty, deserving the harshest sentence. A few felt the evidence, being decades old, wasn't enough. In coffee shops, markets, churches, talks swirled. Will justice prevail this time? The night before the trial, the Magyars lit candles. Dawn gazed at the flickering light on Dawn's photo, whispering, "Tomorrow, justice begins to speak." Eleanor held Peter's hand, his eyes brimming with resolve. Dawn fought, now we fight for her. Outside, Michigan seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the moment truth faced justice's light. On November 5th, 2001, Shiawassee County Circuit Court was packed. Michigan focused on the trial, decades in waiting. Reporters crowded the halls. TV cameras aimed at the entrance where Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter Magyar entered, resolute. In the large courtroom, the 12 jurors sat attentively facing the presiding judge. Across from them, Gerald Wingart, in a drab prison jumpsuit, his gray hair thinner, eyes averted, face ashen. Prosecutor Dwayne Dennis opened with a powerful presentation reconstructing January 27, 1973. Dawn leaving the Owosso Plaza, the dark blue pickup seen by witnesses, the frantic search, the discovery of her body, raped and shot. Then came the forensic evidence, the preserved crime scene samples, the DNA profile, and the 100% match with Wingart's discarded cigarette butt. He detailed Wingart's violent criminal history and presence in the area. "She fought," Dennis's voice boomed, "and that fight, along with modern science, brought the perpetrator to justice today." The defense countered, stressing no direct eyewitness saw Wingart commit the crime. They questioned the chain of custody for evidence preserved since 1973 and the validity of decades-old eyewitness accounts, attempting to sow doubt. But the prosecution meticulously rebutted with specific details. Randy O. Colbury testified to the rigorous preservation and analysis protocols. Detective Harshberger presented a timeline that seamlessly linked Wingart's known movements with the crime. "DNA doesn't lie," Dennis concluded, his eyes fixed on the jury. During the victim's family statement, Peter Magyar, now 29, stood, his hands trembling slightly as he held a framed photo of his young mother. His voice broke, but held firm. "For 28 years, I lived without my mom, without knowing why, without knowing who took her. Today, the truth is proven. My mother was a victim of a ruthless man, and her memory deserves justice. My father, my grandmother, and I beg you to bring her peace." Eleanor sat beside Dawn, both wiping tears. The courtroom fell silent. Some jurors wiped tears. The judge banged the gavel for order, but the Magyar's words had sunk deep. After 5 days of evidence, testimony, and arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. Time crawled. Outside, Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter sat hand in hand, faces tense. Reporters updated. Jury deliberating for 3 hours, 4 hours. Finally, after 8 hours, the jury room door opened. All eyes turned. The clerk read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, the defendant, Gerald Leroy Wingart, is guilty. The courtroom erupted. Eleanor sobbed, embracing Dawn. Peter bowed his head, tears streaming, whispering, "Mom, it's finally done." The judge stood, his voice clear. "This court sentences Gerald Leroy Wingart to life imprisonment without parole. He will spend his remaining days behind bars remembering the crime he committed." Headlines screamed, "Justice delivered. Gerald Wingart sentenced to life without parole." Michigan exhaled. Many gathered outside the Magyar home, lighting candles for justice. On TV, images of Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter, tearful but eyes bright, aired across the state. Detective Harshberger stayed in the emptying courtroom, looking at the evidence board that convicted Wingart. One thought echoed, "Justice may come late, but it came." In that moment, Dawn Lee Swan Magyar's case closed. No longer a cold case, but a belated triumph of truth. Wingart's life sentence without parole ended the trial, but its impact rippled through Michigan and beyond. The community struggled to believe the man they saw as a quiet co-worker, a polite neighbor, was a cold-blooded killer who hid his crime for nearly 3 decades. Neighbors appeared on TV, stunned. "We knew him from Chrysler. Never thought he could do this. It's chilling." The shock shook Michigan, raising questions about how evil can hide in plain sight. Overnight, national papers reported. The New York Times ran, "Michigan man convicted in 1973, cold case murder." While the Washington Post analyzed how DNA comparison became a case-breaking tool, major networks like CNN, NBC, and ABC aired specials emphasizing that Dawn Magyar's case proved cold cases never truly die with technology and persistence. Evening Talk shows hosted forensic experts, investigative journalists, and families of missing persons. A prominent host opened, "What chills us isn't just the crime, but that justice can sleep for nearly 30 years, then awaken with a single cigarette butt." As the media exploded, the Magyar family quietly prepared for a different kind of closure. On December 15, 2001, a memorial service for Dawn took place at St. Christopher Parish, followed by a graveside service where her remains had been laid to rest in 1973. Hundreds attended, not just relatives, but 1973 search volunteers, loyal neighbors, and old friends. The simple headstone, placed decades prior, now felt heavier with meaning. Don stood by the grave, his voice choked. "For 28 years, we visited this stone, wondering. Now, Dawn knows peace." Eleanor, holding Peter's hand, read a letter. "My dearest Dawn, Peter grew up to be a wonderful man. He never forgot you. Now, your killer is where he belongs." The words brought the crowd to tears. People left flowers, lit candles, and some strangers whispered apologies for once believing rumors about the case. The service was not just a farewell, but a cleansing of the community's collective memory. Gerald Leroy Wingart died in prison on August 20, 2022, his final appeal denied, his life ending behind bars, a testament to justice's long reach. For the Magyar family, the decades-long journey ended in tears, but also in faith that Dawn wasn't forgotten. They lived on, carrying her memory, dedicating efforts to cold case advocacy groups. Peter became a strong voice for cold case resolution, sharing his mother's story nationwide. Chesaning remained a quiet Michigan village, but beneath its calm, Dawn Magyar's case left an indelible mark. It reminded that evil can lurk in plain sight, that truth can lie buried for years, but also that justice can return with technology, resolve, and people who refuse to give up. The story of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar's case is not just a personal tragedy, but a reflection of vital truths in American life today. A young mother from Chesaning, Michigan, vanished after a morning shopping trip, leaving her car with purchased items and scattered keys, and a 1-year-old son crying for her. Nearly 3 decades of silence weighed on her family, burdened by rumors and doubt, when in truth, Dawn was brutally murdered, the killer leaving behind DNA evidence. Only through advanced DNA technology in the late 1990s and persistent investigators was the case reopened, bringing Gerald Leroy Wingart to justice in 2001. The first lesson for American society is that technology and science can give voice to victims thought forgotten. Urging investment in forensic labs and DNA databases as a single sample can change a family's fate, proving that perseverance in evidence preservation is paramount. The second lesson lies in family and community perseverance. While public memory faded, Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter held annual vigils, proving families must never give up, even when isolated by apathy. Finally, the story warns of the fragility of everyday safety. A quiet coworker or neighbor can hide a monstrous face. Thus, the lesson for every American today is to stay vigilant, not dismiss odd signs, and keep faith in justice. Justice may be delayed, but with science and persistence, it never vanishes. Thanks for being here and listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care with your loved ones.